Sammy and May had to hide their relationship for years, and when they finally made it public, the backlash was immediate and vicious. Hate mail flooded in. Promoters canceled shows. Southern venues threatened boycotts. And now, weeks before the inauguration, Kennedy's advisors saw a disaster forming. A black entertainer married to a white woman standing on the inauguration stage wasn't just controversial. To them, it was politically radioactive. So the decision was made quietly, efficiently, and cruelly. Sammy Davis Jr. would not be invited to perform. There would be no public announcement, no explanation, just a discreet message passed along through back channels. It was politics at its coldest. Protect the presidency, sacrifice the man. Frank Sinatra was livid. He argued. He yelled. He reminded Kennedy's people of everything Sammy had done. Every rally, every fundraiser, every night on stage selling the dream of a new America. But Frank also understood the game. He'd lived long enough in Hollywood and Washington circles to know when a door was closed. Reluctantly, bitterly, he backed it down. Peter Lawford, Kennedy's brother-in-law, was stuck in the middle. He sympathized, but blood and politics tied his hands. Joey Bishop swallowed it and stayed quiet. Dean Martin did not. When Dean heard that Sammy had been cut loose, his reaction wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't storm around making phone calls or shouting at reporters. He simply asked one question. So, Sammy's out. When Frank nodded, Dean paused for a long moment. Then he said, calmly, "Then so am I." Frank stared at him. "Dino, don't do this. I already did." Frank tried to reason with him. This was the President of the United States. This was history. This was power. This was access. Turning down an inauguration wasn't just unheard of. It was dangerous. Careers were built on moments like this. Relationships were cemented. Favors were owed. Dean listened. Then he said something that ended the conversation. "If Sammy's not good enough to stand there, I'm not good enough either." Dean picked up the phone himself. No agents, no intermediaries. He called the White House liaison handling the gala and left a message that was as blunt as it was final. "Tell the president I won't be attending. I don't go places. My friends aren't welcome." When the message reached Kennedy, it landed like a punch. Presidents-elect did not get refused. Not like this. Not over a singer. Not over a social issue his advisors had already calculated and dismissed. Kennedy reportedly asked, "He really said that?" "Yes, sir." "And he won't reconsider?" "No, sir." For the first time since the election, Kennedy felt something close to shame, because Dean Martin hadn't threatened. He hadn't asked for anything. He had simply drawn a line and stood on the right side of it. Sammy Davis Jr. found out later that day. Frank told him gently, trying to soften the blow. "They don't want you there, Sam. It's politics." Sammy nodded. He'd expected it. He always expected it. Then Frank added. Dean pulled out too. Sammy looked up sharply. "What?" he said. "If you're not welcome, neither is he." Sammy didn't speak for a long time. Then his eyes filled, and he looked away so no one would see. "He didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "No," Frank replied, "but that's Dino." Dean never called Sammy to tell him what he'd done. He didn't want credit. He didn't want gratitude. He didn't want to turn it into a gesture. To Dean, this wasn't a stand. It was a reflex. You don't abandon your friend, especially not when the world already does. The inauguration went on without Sammy Davis Jr. It went on without Dean Martin. The gala was still glamorous. The speeches were still historic. The cameras still rolled. But something was missing, and everyone in the room knew it. Years later, Sammy would talk about that moment, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He said that in a career filled with applause, awards, and standing ovations, Dean Martin's refusal meant more to him than all of it combined, because in a moment when politics demanded silence, Dean chose loyalty. When power demanded obedience, Dean chose friendship. When doing nothing would have cost him nothing, Dean chose to pay a price. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about the decision. When asked years later why he hadn't attended Kennedy's inauguration, he shrugged and said, "I had other plans." But those who knew understood the truth. In January 1961, America crowned a new president, and in that same moment, Dean Martin proved something far rarer than political power. He proved character. Even Sammy Davis Jr. didn't believe it at first. When Frank told him that Dean had torn up his invitation and refused to attend, Sammy thought it had to be exaggerated, some rat-pack bravado that would cool off by morning. Dean Martin didn't do grand political gestures. He didn't posture. He didn't lecture. He didn't need to make statements. That's what made it so hard to comprehend. This wasn't Dean playing tough. This was Dean drawing a line he would not cross. Words spread quickly, but quietly, the way dangerous truths always do. Washington insiders whispered that Dean Martin had lost his mind. Hollywood columnists speculated that he was drunk, emotional, or being manipulated by Frank. Some said he was committing career suicide. Turning down a presidential inauguration wasn't just rude, it was unheard of. In America, you did not say no to power, especially not when that power had just been handed to the youngest president in history. Kennedy heard again that Dean Martin would not be attending. This time, he asked why. Because Sammy Davis Jr. isn't invited. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Kennedy understood exactly what that meant. Dean wasn't negotiating. He wasn't asking for Sammy to be quietly included or hidden in the back. He wasn't demanding special treatment. He was saying plainly that if Sammy was considered unacceptable, then Dean was too. It forced Kennedy to confront something uncomfortable. Not the politics, not the optics, but the cost of compromise. He had chosen power over principle, and one man had refused to play along. Sammy Davis Jr. sat alone in his house in Beverly Hills the night before the inauguration, watching the news coverage. He saw the rehearsals, the flags, the pomp, the speeches about a new America. He felt proud of what he'd helped build and ashamed that he wasn't allowed to stand inside it. Then the phone rang. It was Dean. "I just wanted you to hear it from me," Dean said. "I'm not going." Sammy swallowed hard. "Dino, you don't have to do that." "I know. That's why I am." There was silence. Sammy finally said, "You know, this won't change anything, right?" Dean answered without hesitation. "It changes everything." Sammy cried after he hung up, not because he felt vindicated, but because, for the first time in his life, someone with real power had chosen him without hesitation. Not publicly, not loudly, just decisively. Dean didn't ask Sammy how he felt. He didn't try to comfort him. He simply made sure Sammy wasn't alone in the moment that mattered most. The inauguration went on as planned. Frank Sinatra attended, smiling for cameras, playing his role. Peter Lawford stood proudly beside his brother-in-law. Joey Bishop blended into the background. and there was an empty space where Dean Martin should have been. People noticed. They always noticed Dean. Reporters asked questions. Sinatra, Lawford dodged. The White House said nothing. Behind the scenes, Dean paid a price. Invitations dried up. Phone calls slowed. There were whispers that he was difficult, unreliable, emotional. Studio executives took notes. Political doors closed quietly. But Dean didn't complain. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He went back to doing what he always did. He showed up for his friends. He sang. He lived. Years later, Sammy would say that moment mattered more to him than any civil rights speech, more than any award, more than any standing ovation, because it wasn't symbolic. It was personal. It wasn't safe. It wasn't strategic. It cost Dean something, and that's how Sammy knew it was real. Dean Martin never called himself brave. He never framed it as moral courage. When asked privately why he did it, he gave the same answer every time. That's my friend. In a world where politics demanded silence, Dean chose loyalty. In a moment when history offered him a seat at the table, he chose to stand outside with the man who wasn't allowed in. And long after the speeches were forgotten and the banners taken down, that choice endured. Not because it changed the inauguration, but because it revealed who Dean Martin really was. Dean stood there that day, carrying Sammy's casket. And a lot of people in that church remembered January 1961 in a very different way than they had before. They remembered who had shown up when it mattered and who hadn't. Frank had his regrets. He carried them quietly. Politics had given him access and influence, but it had also cost him something he never fully got back. Dean never carried that weight. He never questioned his choice, never second-guessed it, never framed it as bravery. To him, it was simple. If the room wasn't big enough for his friend, then it wasn't a room worth being in. What made Dean Martin's decision so powerful wasn't that it embarrassed the president or challenged political strategy. It was that it revealed something rare. In a world where everyone calculated risk, Dean acted on instinct. In a moment when silence would have been easier, he spoke without raising his voice. He didn't protest. He didn't grandstand. He just removed himself and let the absence say everything. History remembers John F. Kennedy's inauguration for its soaring words and cold January air. It remembers the glamour, the optimism, the promise of a new era. What it doesn't always remember is the quiet choice made thousands of miles away by a man sitting at home, watching on television, refusing to celebrate a victory that came at the expense of his friend's dignity. That choice didn't make headlines. It didn't change election results, but it changed a man. Sammy Davis Jr. spent his life fighting to be accepted, to be seen as equal, to be treated as more than a symbol or a problem to manage. In January 1961, the country told him he was inconvenient. Dean Martin told him he mattered, and that mattered more than any seat in any hall, more than any photograph with a president, more than any political favor that could ever be repaid. Dean Martin lived in a world of power, fame, and influence, but he never let any of it outrank loyalty. He understood something many powerful people never learn. Principles don't announce themselves. They show up in moments when no one is forcing you to do the right thing, when the cost is real, when the reward is invisible. Years later, people would call Dean cool, effortless, detached. But the truth was deeper than that. Dean Martin felt things very strongly. He just chose when and how to act on them. And when the moment came that tested who he really was, he didn't hesitate. He stayed home. He stood by his friend. And in doing so, he proved that integrity doesn't need an audience. That's why Sammy never forgot it. That's why Dean never regretted it. And that's why, long after the speeches faded and the applause stopped, that quiet decision still speaks louder than any inaugural address ever could. At the funeral, someone asked Dean if he regretted missing Kennedy's inauguration, one of the most historic moments of the 20th century. Dean didn't pause. He didn't dress it up. He didn't soften it for the room. He simply said, "I don't regret anything I did for Sammy." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that inauguration happened whether I was there or not. My friendship with Sammy was real. That mattered more than any political ceremony. That answer told you everything you needed to know about Dean Martin. History books. Remember January 1961 as a turning point. A young president. A new era. Hope wrapped in poetry and ambition. Cameras flashing. Power concentrated on a single frozen morning in Washington. Dean understood all of that. He wasn't ignorant of history. He just knew something else was happening at the same time. Something quieter and far more personal. A man he loved was being told he was inconvenient. A friend was being pushed aside to make powerful people more comfortable. And Dean refused to play along. What Dean Martin did wasn't loud. There were no speeches, no interviews, no headlines declaring his protest. He didn't stand on a stage and condemn racism with a microphone in his hand. He did something much harder. He removed himself. He gave up access. He gave up proximity to power. He gave up a moment most people would spend their lives chasing. And he did it without asking for credit, without even expecting anyone to notice. That's why his choice matters. Civil rights history often focuses on crowds, marches, and moments that forced the world to look. Those moments were essential. But movements are also built in private decisions, in rooms with no cameras, in phone calls that never make the news. Dean Martin then belonged to that category. He was saying, without shouting, "I won't participate in your discrimination. I won't smile for the picture if my friend isn't welcome in the frame." He didn't change a law that day. He didn't rewrite policy, but he did something just as powerful for one man. He told Sammy Davis Jr., in a world that constantly questioned his worth, that he was not negotiable, that his dignity wasn't a bargaining chip, that there was at least one person who would not trade him for influence, applause, or proximity to the most powerful office on earth, and that mattered. Sammy Davis Jr. had spent his life performing for audiences that loved him but didn't always accept him. He'd endured slurs, threats, exclusions, and betrayals, often from the very systems that profited from his talent. When the moment came that should have validated everything he'd worked for, he was quietly erased. Dean Martin didn't fix that injustice, but he refused to benefit from it. He refused to stand in a room that had decided his friend was a problem. That's character. Dean Martin understood something many people with power never learn. Prestige is temporary. Influence shifts. Invitations is speedy. But the way you treat people when it costs you, something stays with you forever. He knew that missing one ceremony wouldn't erase history, but betraying a friend would erase something inside himself. So he stayed home. He watched the inauguration on television, not because he was bitter, not because he wanted to make a statement, but because the room didn't feel honest without Sammy in it. And when people later tried to frame his choice as sacrifice or bravery, Dean never embraced those words. To him, it was simply loyalty, the kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't require applause. John F. Kennedy became president. Frank Sinatra had his night. The speeches were delivered. The cameras rolled. History moved forward exactly as it was always going to. But somewhere outside the spotlight, Dean Martin kept something far more rare: his integrity, his friendship, his certainty that when the moment came to choose between power and principle, he hadn't hesitated. Because presidents come and go, ceremonies fade into photographs, influence changes hands, but real friendship, the kind that stands firm when it's inconvenient, the kind that refuses to compromise dignity for access, that lasts longer than any administration. Dean Martin didn't just skip an inauguration. He chose a man over a moment, a friend over a favor, loyalty over legacy. And in doing so, he proved that the truest measure of character isn't who stands beside you when it's easy, but who you stand beside when it costs you something. That choice never made him president. It made him something better.